Mocking a gift from his black maid, a wealthy man dismisses it as cheap. When he learns its true, priceless value, he's left embarrassed and deeply regretful. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Richard Thompson sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in his corner office on the 47th floor of Manhattan's most prestigious business district. His Italian suit was perfectly pressed, his gold watch catching the morning light as he drummed his fingers impatiently on the table's surface. Around him, board members discussed the company's latest initiative to invest in contemporary art for their office spaces. The Martinez piece would make a statement in the lobby, suggested Sarah Chun, the head of acquisitions. It's generating significant buzz in the art world. Richard barely suppressed an eye roll. Let's focus on profit margins instead of decorations, he cut in, his voice sharp. Art doesn't generate revenue. The room fell silent, his colleagues exchanging uncomfortable glances. They'd seen this before. Their CEO's notorious disdain for anything that didn't directly impact the bottom line. Meanwhile, in a converted garage in Brooklyn, Rosa Johnson worked methodically on her sculpture. The space was small but organized, with various tools hanging on pegboards and clay-stained aprons on hooks. The afternoon light filtered through the single window, illuminating the piece, taking shape under her skilled hands. The sculpture, standing about 2 feet tall, represented her grandmother's stories of resilience and heritage, carved into rich mahogany with intricate patterns that spoke of African traditions. Rosa's hands moved confidently, though her mind wandered to her day job. For 3 years, she had worked as a housekeeper in Richard Thompson's mansion, maintaining his immaculate home while pursuing her art in whatever hours remained. The contrast between her two worlds couldn't be starker: the sterile luxury of his home versus the warm creativity of her studio. The sculpture had taken months to complete, worked on during precious evening hours after long days of cleaning. Each detail was meticulously crafted, from the flowing lines representing her grandmother's journey from Georgia to New York during the Great Migration, to the subtle textures that echoed traditional African tribal patterns. Rosa knew it was her finest work yet, though uncertainty gnawed at her about gifting it to her employer. The following morning, Rosa arrived at the Thompson mansion earlier than usual, carefully carrying the wrapped sculpture. She placed it on Richard's desk in his home office, where he took his morning coffee. Her heart raced as she arranged it just so, hoping that this gesture might bridge the vast gulf between them. Richard arrived home that evening, his shoes clicking against the marble floors. He barely glanced at the package on his desk as he loosened his tie. "What's this?" he asked sharply, noticing Rosa lingering in the doorway. "It's a gift, Mr. Thompson," Rosa explained, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I made it myself. I thought it might add some warmth to your office." Richard unwrapped the sculpture with obvious disinterest, his movements careless with the careful packaging. As the last paper fell away, he barely looked at the piece before his lip curled slightly. "A simple trace," he muttered, pushing it aside with one finger as if it might contaminate his expensive desk. "Please remove it, Rosa. And in the future, stick to your assigned duties." Rosa stood frozen, watching as he turned away, already absorbed in his phone. The sculpture sat discarded at the edge of his desk, its intricate details lost on him. She felt the sting of tears but blinked them back, maintaining her professional composure as she carefully rewrapped the piece. The rejection was not just of her art, but of everything it represented: her hurt, age, her talent, her attempt to connect across the social divide that separated them. As she carried the sculpture back to the kitchen, Rosa's grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Your art speaks truths they ain't ready to hear, child. But keep speaking anyway." The evening light filtered through the small windows of Rosa's grandmother's apartment in Harlem, where decades of family history lined the walls in photographs and artifacts. Rosa sat at her grandmother's worn kitchen table, the rejected sculpture placed between them like a silent witness to their conversation. "Mama Ada," Rosa said, her fingers tracing the wooden patterns, "sometimes I wonder if I'm foolish to keep trying." Mr. Thompson didn't even look at it properly. Ada Johnson's weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes sharp despite her 83 years. "Child, our art ain't never been about their approval. When I was your age, I watched your grandfather carve stories into wood that white folks wouldn't even acknowledge. But those stories kept our history alive. The apartment, though modest, held treasures that no auction house could properly value. Hand-carved figurines from Rosa's grandfather, quilts stitched by generations of Johnson women, and photographs of family members who had created art despite every obstacle society placed in their way. Meanwhile, across town at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual gala, Richard Thompson stood amid a crowd of New York's elite, champagne flute in hand. The event celebrated contemporary artists, though the crowd seemed more interested in being seen than seeing the art. Just acquired a Basquiat, Bradford Wellington III announced to their circle, his bow tie slightly askew after his fourth glass of champagne. Cost a pretty penny, but one must invest in the classics. Richard smiled tightly, nodding as if he understood. Art investments are all about timing, he offered vaguely, repeating phrases he'd heard at similar events. Speaking of investments, interjected Marcus Chun, an art dealer Richard had known for years. That piece in your office, I caught a glimpse during our last meeting. Remarkable work. Reminds me of Jerome Baldwin's early pieces. Richard's expression froze. Jerome Baldwin? The sculptor. One of the most significant African-American artists of the last century. His work rarely comes to market these days. Marcus swirled his drink thoughtfully. The layering technique, the cultural motifs, it's unmistakable. Though I didn't know you collected his work. The conversation moved on, but Richard remained silent, his mind racing. He recalled the sculpture he had dismissed so casually, trying to remember its details through the haze of his prejudice. Jerome Baldwin, the name nagged at him. He'd heard it before, probably at one of these events, but had never paid attention. The piece in your office, Marcus continued, unaware of Richard's internal turmoil, has a signature integration of traditional African artistic elements with contemporary forms. The way the wood is carved to create those flowing lines. Unless I'm mistaken, it's from his final period, before his death in 1985. Richard fumbled with his phone, quickly searching for Jerome Baldwin's work. Images appeared on his screen, sculptures bearing striking similarities to the piece Rosa had given him. His stomach tightened as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Fascinating piece, Marcus added. Must have cost a fortune. Baldwin's works typically sell for millions when they surface. The last one at auction went for $12 million. The gala continued around Richard, but he barely noticed. His mind kept returning to the moment he had dismissed Rosa's gift, the casual cruelty of his words, the way he had refused to even truly look at it. The shame began to build in his chest, not just for potentially missing a valuable artwork, but for something deeper he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself unable to focus on the usual social niceties. The weight of his earlier behavior, combined with the revelation about Jerome Baldwin, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. He made his excuses and left early, his thoughts already turning to how he would face Rosa the next day. Richard spent the entire night researching Jerome Baldwin, his laptop screen illuminating his home office as he dove deeper into the artist's history. Each article, each image, each museum catalog entry made him sink further into his leather chair with growing dismay. Baldwin wasn't just any artist. He was a pivotal figure in American art history, known for mentoring young African-American artists and leaving behind a legacy of unfinished works before his death. The morning light found Richard still at his desk, eyes red from lack of sleep, surrounded by printouts and notes. He'd learned that Baldwin's final works were particularly significant, with several pieces remaining unfinished at the time of his death. These incomplete works had become almost mythical in the art world, with collectors and museums searching for them for decades. When Rosa arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, as she did every morning, Richard was waiting in the kitchen instead of his usual morning meeting. She paused in the doorway, surprised to find him there, noting his rumpled appearance and the unusual intensity in his expression. "Rosa," he began, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. "The sculpture you gave me. I removed it as you asked, Mr. Thompson," Rosa interrupted quietly, moving to begin her daily routine. "No, please wait," Richard said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I need to apologize. I I was wrong. Completely wrong. Not just about the sculpture, but about everything. I've spent the night learning about Jerome Baldwin. Rosa froze, her hand still on the coffee maker. You know about Mr. Baldwin? I should have known about him long before now, Richard admitted. The sculpture. It's his work, isn't it? One of his unfinished pieces. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy. Rosa turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Baldwin was my mentor before he passed. He left several unfinished pieces to his students. That sculpture, she paused, measuring her words, represents both his legacy and our responsibility to continue his work. Richard felt the weight of his ignorance and prejudice even more acutely. I treated your gift with contempt. I didn't even give it the respect of a proper look. I'm deeply sorry, Rosa. But Rosa wasn't ready to accept his apology. Years of similar experiences, of having her art and her heritage dismissed, had built walls that one morning of regret couldn't tear down. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate that you've learned about Mr. Baldwin's importance, but this isn't just about the sculpture's market value. Richard flinched at her accurate assessment of his initial motivation for the apology. You're right, he acknowledged. I'm beginning to understand that I've been blind to so much. The sculpture isn't just art, it's history, culture, identity. It's my grandmother's stories, Rosa added quietly. It's the voices of people who weren't allowed to speak. It's the dreams they held on to, even when told they weren't worth dreaming. Determined to make amends, Richard proposed an idea that had formed during his night of research. I want to organize an exhibition, he announced. Not just of Baldwin's work, but of contemporary African-American artists. Your work, Rosa, the stories that need to be told. Rosa's expression remained skeptical. Art isn't just a business investment, Mr. Thompson. It's not something you can throw money at to fix your conscience. I know, Richard replied, surprising them both with his humility. I'm not trying to buy forgiveness. I'm trying to learn to understand, to use my position to make space for voices I've ignored. Will you help me? Not as my employee, but as an artist? The proposal hung in the air between them, representing both an opportunity and a risk. Rosa studied her employer's face, looking for signs of his usual arrogance, but finding instead an unfamiliar vulnerability. The following week, Richard found himself in Rosa's studio for the first time. The converted garage in Brooklyn was a far cry from his Manhattan office, but there was an energy here that his sterile corporate environment lacked. Finished and half-completed sculptures lined the walls, each telling its own story through wood, metal, and clay. This is where the real work happens, Rosa explained, moving aside some tools to create space. Her usual reserved demeanor had softened slightly in her own space, where she could speak the language of art freely. Each piece starts as a conversation with the material, letting it tell me what it wants to become. Richard noticed a series of photographs pinned to a corkboard, black and white images of African-American artists at work, including one he now recognized as Jerome Baldwin. Your connection to this history? I've been completely ignorant of it all. Most people are, Rosa replied, picking up a small piece she was working on. African-American art has always existed, but it's been pushed to the margins, treated as a footnote. My grandmother used to say that our art is like water. It finds a way through any crack, any opening, because it has to flow. Speaking of her grandmother sparked a series of stories Rosa had never shared before. She told Richard about how her grandmother had worked as a cleaning woman in an art gallery in the 1960s, sneaking looks at technique books after hours, teaching herself to paint when no school would accept her. She couldn't afford canvas, Rosa explained, her voice soft with memory. So she painted on newspaper, on cardboard, on anything she could find. The gallery owner caught her one day, but instead of firing her, he started leaving art supplies accidentally behind. Richard listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his life. The stories wove together art, struggle, resilience, and hope in ways his privileged background had never allowed him to understand. As they discussed plans for the exhibition, Richard began to understand the magnitude of what they were undertaking. We need to do this right, he insisted. Not just show the art, but tell the stories behind it. Create context. That's the challenge, Rosa agreed. These aren't just pretty objects to decorate walls. Each piece carries history, carries voices that need to be heard. However, when Richard started reaching out to his usual contacts in the art world, he encountered unexpected resistance. An exhibition of African American artists? One gallery owner said dismissively. That's a bit niche, isn't it? Our collectors prefer more traditional works. Another suggested relegating it to Black History Month, missing the point entirely. It would fit better with our diversity initiatives, they explained, reducing centuries of artistic tradition to a corporate checkbox. Richard found himself growing increasingly frustrated with the subtle and not-so-subtle racism he encountered. He began to understand what Rosa and countless others had faced their entire lives. They can't see past their own preconceptions, he vented to Rosa during another studio visit. The same way I couldn't before. Now you understand why this matters so much, Rosa responded, working on a new piece inspired by their project. It's not just about getting wall space in a gallery. It's about challenging the entire system that decides what art is worth seeing. The resistance they faced only strengthened Richard's resolve. He began using his business connections in new ways, reaching out to influential figures who might be willing to challenge the status quo. Each rejection became a lesson in persistence, each closed door an opportunity to find another way forward. The late autumn sun cast long shadows through Rosa's studio windows as she contemplated her latest work. Richard sat nearby, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, a far cry from his usual polished appearance. Their weekly planning sessions for the exhibition had evolved into something more personal, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. You should show this piece, Richard suggested, pointing to a sculpture Rosa had been hesitant to display. It's powerful. Rosa shook her head, running her fingers along the carved surface. It's too personal, too raw. The piece, a representation of her experiences in the art world, featured hands reaching through barriers, some broken, some still intact. That's exactly why it needs to be seen, Richard insisted. It tells the truth about what artists like you face. But Rosa's hesitation ran deeper than just this single piece. Despite Richard's encouragement, years of being overlooked and dismissed had left their mark. What if they just see it as another token gesture? What if they're only interested because you're backing it? Richard's response was interrupted by a phone call. His expression darkened as he listened. Another sponsor pulling out, he announced after hanging up. They're concerned about political implications. The challenges they faced were mounting. Several prominent galleries had declined to host the exhibition, citing various excuses that barely masked their prejudice. Corporate sponsors were nervous about associating with what they termed controversial art. Even some artists were reluctant to participate, fearing professional repercussions. At a high-profile charity dinner that weekend, Richard made an impassioned plea for support. Standing before his peers in the business world, he spoke about art's power to challenge and transform. We have an opportunity to correct historical wrongs, he argued, to give voice to artists who have been systematically silenced. The response was polite but cool. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others became suddenly fascinated with their desserts. After his speech, Richard overheard snippets of conversation. He's gone rather political, hasn't he? Such a shame. He used to be so focused on business. This whole diversity thing has gotten out of hand. The rejection stung, but it also strengthened Richard's resolve. Later that night, he called Rosa. I understand now, he said quietly. This is what you've faced your entire career. Not just open hostility, but this polite dismissal. This way they have of making you feel like you're asking for too much by simply asking for equality. Rosa was working late in her studio, adding final touches to a new piece. Welcome to my world, she replied, but without bitterness. The question is, now that you see it, what are you going to do about it? The answer came to Richard as he drove home through the city streets. He would need to risk more than just money. He would need to risk his social standing, his business relationships, everything he'd previously valued. The exhibition wouldn't succeed through half measures or safe choices. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with his company's board of directors. We're going to fund the exhibition ourselves, he announced. Completely. And we're going to do it right. The board members exchanged concerned glances. The shareholders won't like this, one warned. It's not a prudent use of company resources. Then I'll use my personal resources, Richard declared. I'll sell my art collection if I have to. This exhibition matters more than any investment I've ever made. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Rosa's grandmother had suffered a stroke and was in the hospital. Rosa found herself torn between her commitments to the exhibition and her need to be with the woman who had shaped her life and art. In her grandmother's hose pitta, room, surrounded by beeping machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant, Rosa held Ada's frail hand. I don't know what to do, Mama Ada, she whispered. The exhibition is in 3 weeks, but you need me here. Ada, though weakened, squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Your art is your voice, child. Don't let it be silenced again. Richard visited the hospital that evening, arriving after visiting hours with enough influence to be allowed in. He carried a small wooden box, aged and worn. I found this while researching Jerome Baldwin, he explained to Rosa. It's a collection of letters and photographs from his early years. Ada's eyes lit up at the mention of Baldwin's name. Though her speech was affected by the stroke, she gestured for Richard to come closer. He opened the box carefully, spreading its contents on the hospital bed tray. I remember him, Ada managed to say, pointing to a photograph of a young Baldwin teaching students. He taught at the community center. Always said art was our way of fighting back. Richard listened intently as Ada, with effort, shared stories from the civil rights era. She spoke of underground art exhibitions in church basements, of paintings hidden from authorities, of sculptures that carried messages of resistance and hope. Each word was a struggle, but her determination to share these memories was powerful. The exhibition, Ada said firmly, looking at both Rosa and Richard. It needs these stories too. Richard nodded, understanding dawning on his face. Not just the art, but the history behind it. The struggle that made it possible. He turned to Rosa. We can delay the opening. Your grandmother needs you now. But Ada shook her head emphatically. No delays, she insisted. Our stories have been delayed long enough. That evening, Richard stayed late at the hospital, listening as Ada shared more history. Personal stories that weren't in any art books or museum catalogs. He took notes carefully, recording each detail, each name, each forgotten hero of the art world. People think art is just pretty pictures, Ada told him, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her passion. But for us, it was survival. Every brushstroke was an act of defiance. Every sculpture was a declaration. We exist. We matter. We create. The impact of her words was visible on Richard's face. He understood now that the exhibition wasn't just about displaying art. It was about preserving a legacy, about honoring those who had paved the way through their courage and creativity. As he prepared to leave, Ada called him back. You're learning, she said simply. Now help my granddaughter tell her story. But tell it right. I promise, Richard replied. And for the first time in his life, he fully understood the weight and importance of keeping his word. As the exhibition's opening night drew closer, the pressure mounted. Rosa spent her days divided between the hospital, her studio, and the gallery space they'd finally secured in Chelsea. Dark circles formed under her eyes as she worked late into the night, driven by her grandmother's words and her own growing sense of responsibility. The gallery bustled with activity as workers hung paintings and positioned sculptures. Rosa's work would be the centerpiece, a series of pieces that told not just her story, but the story of generations of African-American artists who had fought for recognition. The lighting needs to be adjusted on the central installation, Rosa directed, her voice carrying a new authority. The piece, a massive sculpture incorporating elements from her grandmother's stories and Baldwin's techniques, dominated the main room. It was her most ambitious work yet, a statement about history, identity, and the future of African-American art. Richard, meanwhile, faced growing opposition from his social circle. Anonymous letters arrived at his office, suggesting he was damaging the company's reputation with his political agenda. Several BOA RD members threatened to resign. At his club, longtime associates suddenly found reasons to avoid him. You're committing social suicide, warned Bradford Wellington III over an uncomfortable lunch. This exhibition is not how things are done, There are proper channels, proper times for this sort of thing. Professionals. Richard repeated, his voice tight, with controlled anger. You mean controlled channels? Safe channels. Channels that don't actually change anything. The tension reached its peak when a prominent art critic published a scathing preview article, questioning both Richard's motives and Rose's artistic credentials. The piece implied that the whole exhibition was merely a publicity stunt, an attempt at corporate virtue signaling. Rosa found Richard in the gallery after hours, staring at the article on his phone. Maybe they're right, he said quietly. Maybe I'm just trying to make myself feel better about years of ignorance. Stop, Rosa interrupted firmly. This isn't about you anymore. Look around. The gallery space was transformed. Each piece told a story of struggle, of persistence, of triumph. Photographs and documents from Baldwin's collection provided historical context. Ada's stories were woven throughout, recorded and displayed alongside the artwork. This is bigger than both of us now, Rosa continued. Every artist who agreed to show their work here, every story we're telling, it's all part of something that can't be stopped by one critic or a bunch of uncomfortable socialites. Still, as the final preparations were made, both Rosa and Richard felt the weight of what they were attempting. The art world's resistance wasn't just about aesthetics or tradition. It was about power, about who got to decide what was valuable, whose stories were worth telling. The night before the opening, Rosa worked late in the gallery, making final adjustments. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Art is our way of fighting back. She touched each piece gently, feeling the energy and history they contained. Tomorrow, these works would face the world, and she would face it with them. The gallery hummed with anticipation on opening night. The space, transformed by careful lighting and thoughtful arrangement, barely resembled the empty room they'd started with. Security guards stood discreetly by the doors. Richard had insisted on extra protection after receiving several threatening letters. The first guests began arriving at 7 p.m. sharp. Art world regulars mixed uncomfortably with newer faces. Young artists, community leaders, and students from local art schools. Richard stood near the entrance, his usual confident demeanor masking his nerves as he greeted guests. Interesting choice of artists, remarked Catherine Whitmore, influential gallery owner, her pause carrying volumes of unspoken criticism. Though I wonder about the commercial viability of such a focused exhibition. Rosa moved through the crowd, watching reactions. She noticed how some visitors lingered thoughtfully before each piece, while others merely glanced and moved on, their dismissal evident in their body language. A group of older patrons huddled near the wine table, their whispered conversations punctuated by disapproving glances. The centerpiece of the exhibition, Rosa's massive sculptural installation, drew particular attention. Its size alone demanded acknowledgement, while its complex narrative elements challenged viewers to engage with uncomfortable truths about art world exclusion. The technique is undeniable, a critic muttered to his companion, but it's all rather aggressive, isn't it? Art should elevate, not accuse. Richard overheard and started to respond, but Rosa caught his eye and shook her head slightly. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. The art needed to speak for itself. As the evening progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Younger gallery goers started engaging deeply with the works, asking questions, taking notes. Several artists featured in the exhibition drew crowds as they discussed their pieces, sharing stories that had never been told in such spaces before. Rosa's moment came when she was asked to speak about her work. Standing before the crowd, she felt her grandmother's strength flowing through her. This exhibition isn't just about art, she began, her voice clear and steady. It's about visibility, about challenging who gets to decide what belongs on these walls. The room fell silent as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of generations of excluded artists. She shared stories of her grandmother's struggles, of Baldwin's mentorship, of countless artists who had created despite being told their work didn't matter. Each piece here represents not just an individual artist's vision, she continued, but a legacy of persistence. When you look at these works, you're seeing not just what we created, but what we overcame to create it. The impact was palpable. Even some of the initially skeptical visitors began viewing the pieces with new eyes. A prominent collector, known for his conservative tastes, spent 30 minutes studying Rosa's installation, taking detailed notes. The evening's turning point came when Marcus Chun, the art dealer who had first recognized Baldwin's influence, arrived with an unexpected guest, James Torres, one of the most respected critics in contemporary art. Torres moved through the exhibition slowly, methodically, his expression unreadable. The exhibition was reaching its peak when the scandal broke. A local arts blog published screenshots of emails from Jonathan Pierce, one of Richard's key exhibition sponsors, revealing a history of racist comments about African-American artists. The emails, dated just weeks before the exhibition, showed Pierce dismissing the entire project as pandering to political correctness, while publicly presenting himself as a champion of diversity. The news spread through the gallery like wildfire, phones buzzing with notifications. Pierce himself was present, his face reddening as guests began to whisper and point. He was, unfortunately, not just any sponsor. He was one of Richard's oldest business associates and a major shareholder in his company. "Richard," Pierce called out loudly, creating an uncomfortable scene in the middle of the gallery. "This is obviously a setup. We need to release a joint statement immediately denying these baseless accusations." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Richard, who stood frozen, acutely aware that his response would define not just the evening, but his entire journey of transformation. Pierce wasn't just a sponsor. He represented the old world Richard had been part of, where such attitudes were quietly accepted behind closed doors. Rosa watched from across the room, her heart pounding. This was the moment of truth. Would Richard retreat to the safety of his privileged world, or would he stand firm in his newfound convictions? "No," Richard said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gallery. "No joint statement, Jonathan. No denials. The emails are your words, aren't they?" Pierce's face contorted with anger. "You're making a serious mistake, Richard. Need I remind you of our other business arrangements? The contracts pending? The deals we've built over 20 years?" The threat was clear. Pierce could potentially damage Richard's business empire. Several board members present at the exhibition shifted uncomfortably, clearly calculating the potential financial impact. But Richard had changed too much to go back. "Those emails represent exactly what this exhibition is fighting against," he declared. "The casual racism, the dismissal of talent based on race, the closed doors and whispered prejudices. I won't defend it anymore, Jonathan. You could take your sponsorship and your threats and leave." Pierce stormed out, followed by a small group of conservative patrons. The remaining crowd buzzed with tension and excitement. Social media was already ablaze with the confrontation, with some praising Richard's stance while others predicted the end of his business career. Rosa made her way to Richard's side. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "The exhibition is already open. You could have managed it quietly." "Yes, I did have to do it," Richard replied, looking at the artwork surrounding them. "Everything here speaks truth. How could I do any less?" The media descended on the story immediately. News vans began parking outside the gallery, reporters eager for comments about the scandal. But something unexpected was happening alongside the controversy. The exhibition was gaining unprecedented attention. People who might never have visited were now coming specifically to see what had caused such an uproar. The exhibition's closing night arrived with an intensity no one had anticipated. The scandal had transformed a significant art world event into a national conversation about race, art, and power. The gallery was packed, with lines stretching around the block. Richard stood at the podium, facing the largest crowd the gallery had ever held. Camera lights flashed as he prepared to make his closing speech. But before he could begin, Rosa hurried to his side, her expression urgent. Her grandmother Ada had insisted on attending, despite her health, and was now waiting to make an announcement of her own. "Before we end this exhibition," Richard began, his voice steady, "I need to acknowledge my own journey. When Rosa first gave me a sculpture, I dismissed it without a second glance. I called it a simple traced, words I will regret for the rest of my life." The crowd shifted uncomfortably at his raw honesty. Rosa wheeled her grandmother forward, Ada's presence commanding immediate respect. The elderly woman's eyes were bright with purpose, despite her physical frailty. But the truth about that sculpture, Richard continued, is even more remarkable than its artistic value. Rosa, your grandmother has something to share with us all. Ada's voice, though weakened by her stroke, carried clearly through the hushed gallery. Jerome Baldwin was my teacher, she began, but he was also my friend. When he died, he left his unfinished works to his students, but with the condition that they complete them in their own way, adding their voice to his. A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications began to sink in. The critic James Torres stepped forward, his expertise suddenly relevant. The lost Baldwin pieces, he breathed. The art world has been searching for them for decades. The sculpture Rosa gave you, Ada continued, looking at Richard, was one of Baldwin's final works. But what makes it truly special is that Rosa didn't just complete it, she transformed it. She took Baldwin's foundation and built upon it something entirely new, something that speaks to both past and present. The revelation hit the art world like a thunderbolt. The piece that Richard had dismissed so casually was not just valuable. It was historically significant, representing a direct connection between generations of African-American artists. This exhibition, Rosa spoke up, her voice strong with emotion, was never about proving our worth to the art world. It was about claiming our space, telling our stories, and continuing the work of those who came before us. Every artist here is part of that legacy. Richard stepped back to the podium, his face showing the weight of the moment. I promise to use my influence to promote African-American art. That promise stands, not because of the value of any single piece, but because these stories deserve to be told, these voices deserve to be heard. The exhibition closed with an announcement that shocked everyone. Richard was converting his company's entire art collection budget into a foundation supporting African-American artists. Pierce and his supporters had indeed pool. Their business, but others, inspired by Richard's stand, had stepped forward with new partnerships. As the crowd finally thinned, Rosa stood before her sculpture, the piece that had started everything. Ada held her hand, both women crying quietly. Richard joined them, no longer the arrogant executive who had dismissed a gift, but a changed man who had learned to see with new eyes. Your grandfather would be proud, Ada said to Rosa, then looked at Richard. And you, young man, you finally learned to listen. The sculpture stood as a testament to their journey, a bridge between past and present, between cultures and generations, between ignorance and understanding. It was more than art. It was a symbol of transformation, proof that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places.